$22 trillion gone, vanished from every tax system on earth. Hidden in places most people have never heard of. The British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, the Cook Islands, places with populations smaller than a suburban town, but hosting more wealth than the entire economy of the United States. 22 trillion, that's the conservative estimate from the Tax Justice Network. The real number could be 32 trillion, could be more. Nobody knows for certain, because that's the point. This money exists in a parallel financial universe specifically designed to be invisible, untraceable, untaxable, forever. This isn't money owned by criminals. Well, ... Not just criminals. This is wealth hidden by sitting presidents, prime ministers, royal families, Fortune 500 CEOs, tech billionaires, hedge fund managers, university endowments, the most respectable people on earth, all using the exact same structures, all facilitated by banks you've heard of, law firms you trust, accounting firms that audit public companies, all completely legal, all professionally managed, all protected by international treaties that make it nearly impossible to prosecute. And here's what should terrify you. The system isn't breaking down. It's perfecting itself. Despite 3 massive leaks exposing millions of documents, despite global outrage, despite promises of reform from every government, the offshore system is bigger today than ever before, growing faster than the legitimate economy, attracting more wealth every year, because the people who could shut it down are the people using it, their families use it, their donors use it, their future employers use it. So instead of closing it, they protect it. Quietly, systematically, permanently. Let me show you how $22 trillion disappears without breaking any laws. How a system built over a century now operates with industrial efficiency, processing billions daily, creating structures in minutes, making wealth vanish before governments even know it existed, and why every attempt to stop it has failed. Deliberately. The offshore world wasn't created by accident. It was designed intentionally, starting in the 1920s when the British Empire was collapsing. Wealthy British families saw the future, higher taxes, labor governments, wealth redistribution, estate duties that would destroy family fortunes. But Britain still controlled territories, Caribbean islands, Pacific outposts, small places with their own legal systems but British protection. And crucially, no obligation to enforce British tax law. A lawyer in London had an idea. What if you created a company in one of these territories? The company would be legally separate from you, could own assets, open bank accounts, conduct business, but because it was registered in the Cayman Islands, it paid no British tax. And because the Caymans had no income tax, it paid nothing there either. Zero tax anywhere, as long as the money stayed offshore. The structure was brilliant. You maintained control through lawyers who served as nominee directors, through bearer shares, physical certificates that proved ownership without recording your name, through multiple layers of companies owning companies. The British government couldn't see through it, couldn't tax it, couldn't even prove you owned it. This was the birth of the shell company, the foundation of everything that followed. At first, ... Just a few families used this, moving a few million pounds, protecting old money from new taxes. But word spread through private clubs, through family lawyers, through the networks that connect the wealthy across borders. And other territories noticed, if the Caymans could attract British money, why couldn't Bermuda? Why couldn't the British Virgin Islands? A competition began, a race to offer the most secrecy, the most protection, the least oversight. And then Switzerland perfected the other half. In 1934, Switzerland passed banking secrecy laws, making it a criminal offense for any banker to reveal client information. Not just to foreign governments, to anyone ever. Prison sentences for bankers who talked. This wasn't about preventing crime. This was about attracting money, creating absolute protection for depositors. Numbered accounts where your name never appeared. Just a number the bank knew who you were. But legally, they could tell no one. Not tax authorities. Not police. Not even Swiss courts without extraordinary proof of serious crime beyond tax evasion. American millionaires noticed, European aristocrats noticed, and the money flowed. First millions, then billions protected by Swiss law, growing in Swiss banks, compounding tax-free, while home countries had no idea it existed, couldn't prove it existed, couldn't tax what they couldn't see. By the 1970s, this had industrialized. Panama specialized in shell companies, Luxembourg in holding companies, Liechtenstein in foundations, Monaco in residency schemes. Each jurisdiction carved out a niche, some focused on banking secrecy, some on corporate vehicles, some on trusts that lasted forever, but all shared one principle: secrecy, minimal disclosure, maximum protection, and they competed fiercely, lowering barriers, eliminating requirements, making it easier and easier to hide wealth. The law firms professionalized. Instead of creating structures one at a time, they mass-produced them. Standard forms, standard procedures. You could walk into Mossack Fonseca in Panama and buy a shell company like buying a suit off the rack. Basic BVI company, $2,000. More complex, multi-jurisdictional structure. Maybe 20,000 pocket change compared to the taxes you'd avoid. And these firms didn't just serve criminals. They advertised in financial magazines, attended wealth management conferences, pitched their services to banks and accounting firms. This was legitimate business, professional services, respectable work, and the banks became the distribution network. Every major bank created private wealth divisions: HSBC, Credit Suisse, HSBC Deutsche Bank, GP, all offering international tax planning to clients with over $10 million. The pitch was always the same: you're paying too much tax. We can help legally through structures used by thousands of clients, approved by regulators, completely proper. And the structures they recommended: shell companies, offshore trusts, foundations in Liechtenstein, all designed for one purpose: make wealth invisible. By 2000, economists estimated $10 trillion offshore. By 2010, $15 trillion. The growth was exponential because offshore wealth compounds faster. No tax drag means every dollar of return gets creating more return, creating more wealth to hide. The cycle feeds itself, while onshore economies, the ones that pay taxes, grow slower, accumulate less, fall further behind. But this remained theoretical, estimated, suspected, but not proven. The offshore world operated in shadows. Law firms protected client confidentiality. Banks refused to share information. Jurisdictions passed secrecy laws, making disclosure criminal. Governments knew wealth was fleeing, but couldn't prove where it went, couldn't demonstrate the scale, couldn't build political will for reform without hard evidence. And then April 3rd, 2016 changed everything. A German newspaper called Süddeutsche Zeitung received an anonymous message: I have information. That was all. Over months, the source delivered documents, then more documents, then millions of documents from inside Mossack Fonseca, the Panamanian law firm that created offshore structures for anyone who could pay. 3.6 terabytes of data, 11.5 million files. The largest leak in history. The International Consortium of Investigative Journalists spent a year analyzing them, coordinating with journalists from 80 countries, and on April 3rd, they published the Panama Papers. The results were devastating. 214,000 offshore entities exposed, shell companies, secret trusts, foundations linked to 12 current or former world leaders, over 100 politicians, hundreds of billionaires, all using identical structures, all hiding wealth, all documented. Iceland's prime minister had hidden millions offshore during the financial crisis, while imposing austerity on his people. Putin's closest allies moved billions through shell companies, avoiding sanctions, laundering money. The father of Britain's prime minister used offshore trusts to avoid UK taxes. For decades, athletes and actors channeled hundreds of millions through Caribbean companies, And corporations, some of the largest on earth, used the same structures as drug cartels because the system didn't discriminate, didn't judge, just hid for anyone willing to pay. If this is starting to show you the scope, the industrial scale of this theft, then you need to understand it gets worse, much worse. Hit subscribe, because what comes next reveals that Panama was just one firm, one leak. The network is far larger than anyone imagined. The Panama Papers should have ended this, should have triggered global reform. Governments promised action. The OECD announced new transparency measures. The EU demanded beneficial ownership registries. Banks pledged to stop facilitating offshore structures. For a moment, it seemed like change was possible. But then the moment passed, the outrage faded. And 80 months later, it happened again. November 5th, 2017. The Paradise Papers, 13.4 million documents from Appleby, a different offshore firm, more upscale, more expensive, serving the absolute elite. Corporations, governments, universities. The leak showed Apple routing billions through Jersey and Ireland, avoiding taxes on over $250 billion in offshore profits. Nike using Dutch and Bermuda structures. Facebook channeling earnings through the Cayman. These weren't small businesses evading taxes. These were trillion-dollar companies using the same offshore tricks as criminals. All legal, all approved by regulators, all facilitated by the world's most prestigious firms. And the individuals, even more stunning. The Queen of England invested in offshore funds, never disclosed. Wilbur Ross, U.S. Commerce Secretary, maintained partnerships with Russian oligarchs through Cayman entities while serving in government. Tech billionaires used Bermuda vehicles to defer capital gains indefinitely. And universities, institutions claiming to serve the public, invested endowments through offshore structures, Harvard, Stanford, MIT, avoiding taxes on investment income while accepting taxpayer subsidies. The pattern was clear. This wasn't criminal fringe activity. This was mainstream, institutional, standard practice for anyone with serious wealth. The offshore system wasn't some dark corner of finance. It was finance, the real system, the one the wealthy actually used, while telling everyone else to pay their taxes. And then October 3rd, 2021. The Pandora Papers, 11.9 million documents from 14 offshore service providers, the largest leak yet, exposing 35 current and former world leaders, 300 public officials, the King of Jordan, using offshore companies to buy properties in the US and UK worth over 100 million. While his country struggled with poverty, the president of Kenya's family moving money offshore while investigating corruption at home. The president of Ecuador, the prime minister of Czech Republic, on, leader after leader, using the system they publicly condemned. 3 leaks, 3 different firms, 3 separate years, millions of documents, thousands of names. And what happened? Investigations were launched. Some politicians resigned. A few prosecutions occurred for obvious money laundering. But the offshore system, it didn't shrink. It grew between the Panama Papers in 2016 and 2022. The Tax Justice Network estimated offshore wealth increased from 20 trillion to 22 trillion, 2 trillion more, while governments investigated, while media exposed, while public demanded reform. The money kept flowing offshore because the leaks only caught a fraction. One firm out of hundreds, 1 year out of decades. 1% of the total, and the industry learned, became more careful, more encrypted, changed procedures, moved to new jurisdictions. The leaks didn't destroy the system. They made it smarter, more resilient, harder to penetrate. But why do these leaks change nothing? Because reform requires political will. And political will requires politicians who aren't compromised, but they are completely The Panama Papers exposed politicians from 39 countries. The Pandora Papers added 35 more world leaders. These are the people who would have to pass reform laws, who would have to close loopholes, who would have to shut down tax havens. But they're using the havens. Their families are hiding money. Their donors demand these structures stay open. How can they reform a system they're personally benefiting from? So instead, they create appearances of action. The OECD launched a common reporting standard. Countries agree to automatically exchange tax information, share data on foreign accounts. Sounds perfect, except the United States. The biggest economy, refused to join, demanded information from others, shared almost nothing back. And the tax havens, they complied by sharing useless data, names without balances, balances without names, information so incomplete it's meaningless, compliance theater, looking like progress, changing nothing. The European Union tried beneficial ownership registries, public databases showing who really owns shell companies. Several countries implemented them and immediately granted exceptions for trusts created before a certain date, for foundations with certain structures, for entities claiming privacy concerns. The registries exist, but they list law firms as owners. Corporate nominees, not the billionaires actually controlling the wealth. The industry adapted, created new layers, made the registries irrelevant. And enforcement, the IRS Offshore Compliance Division has roughly 200 employees trying to track trillions hidden in thousands of structures across dozens of jurisdictions, with law firms fighting every request. Banks claiming privacy protections, countries refusing cooperation. It's impossible. Deliberately impossible. The penalties for noncompliance are tiny, a few $1,000s typically, maybe $50,000 for egregious violations. Meanwhile, the tax avoided is millions, billions. The cost-benefit analysis is obvious. Pay trivial fines if caught, save massive taxes if not, and most violations are never discovered. Do you see what this means? Do you understand what you're funding? Every time you pay taxes, you're subsidizing a system that protects people who pay nothing. Your taxes fund courts that enforce their contracts, military that protects their assets, infrastructure they use, education that trains their employees, everything while they contribute nothing. They've privatized wealth, socialized costs, and called it success. The 22 trillion offshore isn't abstract. It's real wealth that should be taxed, according to Gabriel Zucman, economists at UC Berkeley. If that 22 trillion paid the same tax rate as the upper middle class, roughly 24%, it would generate 5.3 trillion in annual tax revenue, 5.3 trillion every year. That's enough to eliminate the US deficit, fund universal health care, rebuild infrastructure, pay for education. Everything politicians claim we can't afford, the money exists. It's just hidden legally with help from the most prestigious institutions offshore. And this money isn't sitting idle. It's invested, buying real estate in global cities, driving up prices beyond what locals can afford. Because offshore buyers use pre-tax wealth, you're competing with your after-tax income against their billions that never saw a tax bill. You can't win. Mathematically, they'll always outbid you, always push prices higher, always make housing unaffordable, while living in jurisdictions that contribute nothing to the communities they're displacing. It's buying companies, taking them private, load them with debt, extracting fees, laying off workers, all managed through offshore vehicles, paying no tax on the profits, while the workers they fired pay taxes on unemployment benefits, funded by taxpayers to support people whose jobs were eliminated by offshore funds. The cycle of extraction is complete, and it's compounding, growing 8% annually. That's 1.76 trillion in new offshore wealth every year, more than Canada's entire economy every year, flowing from the taxable world into the shadow, where it'll stay forever unless something fundamental changes, unless the system is forced to reveal, forced to repatriate, forced to contribute. But that would require revolution, not reform. because reform is controlled by people benefiting from the current system. If this has revealed the complete parallel financial universe operating above the law, if you're understanding that $22 trillion exists specifically to avoid contributing to societies it profits from, if you're seeing that every major institution is complicit, then you need to see what comes next. Subscribe now, because the next episode exposes the enablers, the big four accounting firms, the prestigious law firms, the banks you trust, names, structures, specific techniques, how they market tax evasion as financial planning, how they escape prosecution, and why they'll never stop. The offshore system is permanent, not because it's impossible to shut down, but because shutting it down would hurt the people who make the decisions. Politicians would lose funding, regulators would lose future employment, lawyers would lose clients, bankers would lose fees. Everyone in power benefits, directly or indirectly, from keeping the system exactly as it is, growing, expanding, attracting more wealth every year, and the propaganda is perfect. When reform is proposed, billionaire-funded think tanks publish papers claiming it's unconstitutional, unworkable, economically destructive. The media amplifies these claims. Politicians repeat them. The reform dies. And the offshore world continues protected, invisible, untouchable. The 22 trillion hidden offshore is the final proof that the global financial system is rigged, that democracy has been purchased, that laws protect wealth over people, that institutions serve donors over citizens. It's not a bug. It's the feature. The intended outcome of decades of lobbying, of regulatory capture, of bought politicians and complicit enablers all working toward one goal: ensure that wealth, once it reaches a certain level, never contributes again to any society ever. You work, they hide, you pay, they compound you, sacrifice, they accumulate, and the gap between what exists and what's taxable grows wider every year until 22 trillion becomes 30, then 40, until half of global wealth exists in the shadow, controlled by thousands, denied to billions. While governments claim poverty, claim inability to fund basic services, claim the money doesn't exist, but it does. 22 trillion of it, just hidden offshore forever.